Variable declaration is a essential concept of any programming language. So today we will be looking into how variable declaration, or in short, you can say variable creation, is done in JavaScript. So there are three keywords that we generally use to create a variable. One is var, another one is let, and third one is const. Obviously they have their differences, right? When should we use var, when should we use let, and when should we use const. But that's not the uh, concept that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about the more subtle part of how a variable declaration is done and how it is done at the memory level. So we're going to be looking into that part. So let's say I'm just opening up my id. Let's say if I do this, right, if I type var c equals to 9, and if I run console.log C, right, and if I run my code in here, I will see that 9 gets printed out on my console, right? So what we have done, we have created a variable here. Why I'm saying that variable creation, and why I'm not referring it as a declaration or anything else, that we will see uh, next. So a variable is created here, creation of variable. So when we do this, right, like when we use any keyword, var, let, or const to create a variable, a series of processes goes on. Okay. So what are those processes? Basically, there are three process or three phases or three steps that we generally see. First step is the declaration phase or the declaration step. Second phase is the initialization phase or initialization step. Third one is the assignment phase. Okay. So whenever you are declaring a variable, whenever we declare any variable, whether it with var or let or const, these three phases are undergone internally by whenever we run our code. So what happens basically, we write our code in here. So let's say like we wrote some lines of code, right? It is fed to the JavaScript engine, right? The JS engine can be inside your browser, can be in any runtime, maybe Node.js, maybe Bun.js, maybe IO.js, or any runtime that is available. It has a JavaScript engine. That engine has interpreter, compilers. So basically that this process is done in the interpretation phase. Okay. First the declaration phase happens, then the initialization phase happens, and then the assignment phase happens, and then finally we get the variable accessible in our program. Now we're going to be looking into what are these three steps that we talked about, and what happens during each of these steps. So first let's just talk about the declaration phase or the declaration step. This declaration phase is can be considered as occupation or acquisition of memory. So our system, right, like obviously we when we're going to be writing a program, when we're going to be writing some JavaScript code, it would be run on any machine, on a system. That system would be having some RAM, which is like random access memory. This RAM is generally distributed into two segments. One is stack and one is heap. Any of those memory from RAM, maybe stack, maybe heap, can be utilized for acquisition of that memory space. So generally what happens, like I'm going to be considering it as a RAM only. So what happens when you create a variable, a memory acquisition happens, right? A piece of memory depending on the value that you are storing in it. For example, if you are storing a number, so it's gonna be taking 64 bits. Okay, that is something like 8 bytes. And if you are storing a string, that is gonna be taking 4 bytes. So depending on that, depending on what variable, what value you are storing in here, what variable, what value you are storing inside that variable. For example, let's say var c equals to 9 in here, which we have taken. So right now we are storing a number, so 8 bytes of memory would be occupied. Okay, that's where the declaration phase happens. Now, second phase, that is the initialization phase. Okay, so initialization phase, as the name suggests, that some value is initialized to the memory space that have been just created above in the above step. So what JavaScript specially does, JavaScript assigns, or JavaScript initializes that memory space with undefined value. JavaScript initializes the memory space with undefined value. That's a very important factor, right, in terms of hoisting that we're going to be discussing in other video. Okay, so that's what an initialization phase happens. So basically when you do this, where c equals to 9, this particular thing, if you just run it separately, c would store a undefined value at some point of time because of this initialization phase that it went through. The last phase that actually happens is the assignment phase. Okay, in this assignment phase, what happens, the actual value that you want to store, for example in the above example what we took, where c equals to 9, so we are storing 9 in it. So in the memory space that just we created in the declaration phase, 9 gets assigned to it. This 9 value gets stored inside that memory space, and that finishes off the whole life cycle of variable creation. Okay, and these phases are very much remarkable in terms of hoisting as well. So generally people consider that let and const don't undergo hoisting, but that's not the case. Hoisting is a default behavior of JavaScript, and let and const also undergo hoisting. But in case of let and const, the assignment phase happens in the end, but the declaration phase is happens separately, and the initialization and assignment phase happens separately. Okay, but in case of var, declaration and initialization happens at the same time. That's why when we try to access the value before it is actually assigned, right, the var value, we get an undefined output, but in case of let and const we get an error. So that's a part of some separate discussion. But yeah, you can consider this three life cycle phases that are pretty much important for a variable creation in JavaScript. It can be related with the land acquisition, right? Consider that you are buying a plot. Let's say like you have a land in your area and you want to buy a plot. Okay, so you went to the authority, you went to the government office, you bought a plot, right? So you submitted your documents and everything, right? So you bought up that plot. So you can consider that part as a declaration part. It's a declaration phase, right? You buying the plot. Now once you bought the plot, what you did, you you spread some fancies, you just to parameterize the area, and maybe you created a wall around it, you do some, or maybe you created a small room in it, right? So that's basically, you can consider it as initialization, right? You initialized your plot, you initialized your whatever the house that you bought, right? Like land acquired, whatever the land you acquired, you initialized it with something. Okay. Then when you actually built a house, right, you created a beautiful house on your land, right, with four houses, with four rooms, and with everything, with lawn, with swimming pool and everything. That's when the real assignment happens. Same thing happens with the memory acquisition, so you can compare the land acquisition with the memory acquisition. Okay, so the same thing happens during the declaration phase, the initialization phase, and the assignment phase. And every variable that you create in JavaScript goes through all these three different phases. Now it depends on where, let, and const at which phase. Like some phases happens together, right? For example, in case of where, declaration and initialization takes place at the same time, but the assignment takes place lately. So that's a different thing, that's a part of some other story. Okay, so that's a part of this video. Thank you.